Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Lamberson. I was trained as a physician assistant, and I'm a member of the outreach team for the film Medicating Normal, and I host conversations like this one today. Our guest today is attorney Jim Gottstein. He grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. He attended Harvard Law School and graduated in 1978. He then went into private practice in Anchorage alongside Robert Goldberg, primarily representing Alaska Native organizations. In 1982, he had a psychotic break secondary to sleep deprivation, which we'll discuss further when we talk to him in this interview. He's now mostly retired from the private practice of law. In 2002, Jim founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, also called PsychRights, to mount a strategic litigation campaign against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock, and to inform the public about the counterproductive and harmful nature of the drugs and shock. If you'd like to read Jim's full long bio, we'll link it in the comments and the description for you to reference. Also, Jim is the author of the book, The Zyprexa Papers, which you'll see behind him in his image there. And yeah, welcome, Jim. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yeah. Before we got started and went live here, I told you that David Healy wrote and requested that you come on. So if David's out there watching, we have Jim for you here today. And he specifically wanted to hear you tell the story about the Zyprexa papers. But I think as an introduction, it might be good to start where we talk about how you even got introduced to, psychiatric stuff to begin with, which I touched on a little in your bio, that you were sleep deprived and you had a psychotic break. And then you moved into an interest in legal representation and advocacy for people with so-called mental illness. So do you want to tell us a little bit about when that started, how it happened, and that kind of thing?
You bet. Interestingly, my mother was actually the executive director of the Alaska Mental Health Association before that. And I remember the DART program, Depression Awareness, Research and Treatment, that the drug companies were promoting, and the Mental Health Association got a grant, in Alaska. And now I realize that this was, part of the whole fraudulent antidepressant marketing, scheme that the drug companies did, co-opting the Alaska Mental Health Association. But anyway, yeah, I've been practicing law for 3.5 years with Bob Goldberg, and I decided to open my own law practice. And so I had a little bit of involvement with mental health, but not that. And so I decided to open my own law practice. I was running for the state legislature at the same time, and I'd gone to Europe and just got back, and I was behind. And there was just so much to do, I couldn't sleep. And so I basically went crazy. I mean, one of the things, I had gone over to my dad's house to try and sleep, and I had just fallen asleep, I think, for a second, which is kind of something that I've experienced before. When you get in this state, you sleep for just a very short period of time. Anyway, so I woke up, and I heard the devil coming down the hall. And so it was the second floor, and I had looked out the window. I mean, the devil was coming down the hall, so that was perfectly logical, right? And there was a sidewalk down there and a lawn, but I knew how to do a parachute landing fall, and I figured if I missed the sidewalk, I'd be fine. It was 1 a.m. in Anchorage. I was in my underwear, and I jumped out the window. I did a parachute landing fall, didn't hurt myself. I ran across the street, and in this big parking lot, and I kept looking over my shoulder for the devil, and so I was spinning around. And And they came in, captured me, put me in a straitjacket, and hauled me off to the hospital. And before that, I had no idea that my mind could be unreliable. It just wasn't a concept. And I was on track to, do law and, basically be an ordinary person, which, David Oakes says is highly overrated, of course. And that's really, well, I was told, those that believed I was a lawyer said I'd never do that again. And when I told them I was from Harvard Law School, that confirmed I was delusional. And, and all this stuff was easily ascertainable, but they just assumed I was delusional. And so I was in the hospital for 30 days, given Mellaril, and told, again, I would never do that again. I'd have to be on these, debilitating drugs for the rest of my life. And maybe I could avoid, being in the hospital a lot. And so I think of it as a abandon hope all ye who enter here system is, the mental health system. It hasn't really changed. But I was really lucky. My mother hooked me up with this psychiatrist, Robert Alberts, who had been a prisoner of war Japanese prisoner of war in World War II in Indonesia. Anyway, so he told me basically all, that anybody who doesn't get sleep for long enough will, become psychotic, to use a clinical term, which I don't like that much. And all and I just needed to manage that. And so, and I have, we could talk more about how I do that. And there's like a 9-minute video on YouTube, Escape from Psychiatry, Jim Gottstein's story, where I go through it. But that really, changed the trajectory of my life to where I became interested in, what happens to people. So, and so I was involved in this giant litigation over the state of Alaska stealing 1 million acres of land granted to Alaska's mental health program. And I served on the Alaska Mental Health Board, and I pretty much knew the story of the drugs, that they weren't really helpful and harmful and debilitating. But I didn't feel like I could do much, add anything to what really great people were doing all around the country, and didn't focus on it until I read Robert Whitaker's Mad in America in 2002. And to me, in addition to being a great read, it was a litigation roadmap for how to challenge forced drugging, not just on kind of the civil rights aspect of it, but that it's not in people's best interest. And I actually crashed the NARPA conference, National Association of Rights Protection and Advocacy, that year, and met Bob Whitaker and Lauren Mosier and Michael Perlin, who's maybe was one of the top mental health lawyers in the country, or was. He's a professor. And I founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights to do that. And as you said, to mount a strategic litigation campaign against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock. And I got Bob Whitaker, to send me all of the articles he cited in Mad in America. And those are posted on the psychrights.org website. Okay, so I'll stop now for that. I think that was more than you expected.
Yeah, no, that's a good introduction. So you talk about Bob Whitaker sort of opening the door to the thought that these interventions, including psychiatric drugs, are not in people's best interest. So maybe then we should talk about the Myers case that you were a part of, to sort of, set the scene for how you got involved in the Zyprexa papers.
Yeah, so kind of immediately thereafter, I think it was March of 2003, I represented Faith Myers in a forced drugging case, and I had known Faith before that, I had kind of helped found this Alaska Mental Health Consumer Web. I don't know what it should be described as, but maybe a drop-in center or something like that. Anyway, and she wanted to fight the enforced drugging, and all of her stuff is on the PsychRights website. And I mean, under the statute, it said if the person is found to be incompetent to decline the drugs, then the hospital got to do whatever they want. Excuse me. Well, the first thing is, I mean, people can read Faith's testimony, and I defy anybody to say she was not competent to decline. But anyway, the judge found that she was, and the statute said if the person's incompetent to decline the drugs, then the hospital gets to do whatever they want. Mm-hmm. And I said, wait a minute. You have to at least, under the Constitution, show that it's in the person's best interest and there's no less intrusive alternatives, which is what the Alaska Supreme Court ruled. And as relevant to the Zyprexa papers, as part of that case, Dr. Grace Jackson, who's a fabulous psychiatrist and written a couple of good, books, including Rethinking Psychiatry. But she did a study of this, of the data that Eli Lilly submitted to the FDA for approval of Zyprexa, and then, as part of her testimony, wrote this expert report called olanzapine, dangerous drug, dubious efficacy, or something like that. And I post all this stuff on the internet. Mm-hmm. So to get ahead a little bit. And so that's really how I got involved in the Zyprexa papers, is that was found actually by Alex Berenson, the reporter for the New York Times, who's already working with Dr. David Eagleman. Mm-hmm. And they thought I might be willing to subpoena Dr. Eagleman for these, secret documents that showed that Eli Lilly hid that it caused diabetes in a pretty large percentage of people, and massive weight gain in people, even if they didn't get diabetes in a pretty short period of time. And people gaining 100 pounds in a year on Zyprexa. And the doctors were noticing this, and Lilly said, "Oh no, that's their schizophrenia," And
right. Yeah.
So and they and also that Lilly was illegally marketing it to children and the elderly.
Okay. So you've set this precedent then in the Alaskan Supreme Court that it has to be in the best interest of the patient, or at least, can't be harmful to the patient. And then you mentioned Dr. Eagleman contacting you, and also Alex Berenson, who was the New York Times reporter. How did they at the time know that, Zyprexa was problematic, that there was these sealed documents? I guess I'm curious how, they got involved and how it all came to be that you even knew that something was wrong.
So there were all these people getting diabetes and other metabolic problems from after taking Zyprexa, and there were these huge number of lawsuits, tens of thousands of lawsuits filed around the country. And there's this process called multi-district litigation, where all these lawsuits are consolidated into one federal court for discovery and settlement purposes. Well, discovery is the process where the parties are required to provide information relevant to the lawsuit. Mm-hmm. And Eli Lilly and the plaintiffs negotiated this secrecy agreement called a protective order that said anything that Lilly could mark documents as confidential, and then they would be subject to the secrecy order. And Dr. David Eagleman was an expert witness. He's a physician. I call him a physician of conscience, hired by the plaintiff's lawyers, and he had access to these secret documents. And he discovered these documents that I just described, that Lilly knew that it caused diabetes and these other problems, and that they were illegally marketing it. And he felt the public should, be made aware of this. And under the secrecy agreement, of course, he couldn't, just give it to someone. But if he was subpoenaed by someone in another case, then he had to give Lilly a notice about the subpoena and a reasonable opportunity to object before he, produced or gave the information. So, so they thought, because of Dr. Jackson's study, that I might be interested in doing that.
I see. So just quickly, why would the plaintiffs agree to seal something like that? I mean, is that like a common secrecy thing that happens a lot to protect a drug company?
Oh yeah, it's almost universal, and I actually write about the secrecy in the Zyprexa papers and what the reasons for it and all that, and how the system is broken. But basically, the lawyers are there to get money, to make money, and they do that by getting money to their clients, of which they take 40% now. And so their big goal is to, make money on this litigation. And it's just easier. I mean, they don't want to fight about making it secret. The companies, Eli Lilly in this case, they really want to keep this information secret. So they insist on it. And so rather than fight over each document over whether it should be secret or not, the plaintiff's lawyers just agree to it. And worse than that, I mean, that's bad, really bad. But in the settlement agreements, usually the companies say, we're not going to settle unless your clients agree to keep all this information secret. And so and that's a big incentive for the companies, in this case, the drug companies, to settle, is they supposedly get to keep all this information secret. And people might know Dr. Peter Gurcha, who's anyway, I won't say too much about him, but he's written a book called Deadly Psychiatry and Organized Denial. And in that book, he estimated by about 2013, 200,000 people had been hooked by Zyprexa. And since then, he told me he looked at the data more, and it was closer to 400,000 people had been killed by Zyprexa by the end of 2013. So, we're talking about a really harmful product that basically the judicial system allowed to keep secret. The judges are supposed to look after the public interest, but basically if the parties want to keep it secret, they will, and because they want to get these cases settled too. There's no one looking out for the public interest in these cases.
Right. And Lilly, up to that point, they had already hired doctors, right? That said, oh yeah, this is a problem, and sort of tried to encourage them to come clean, correct?
That's exactly right. I mean, there's an email in the Zyprexa papers that where this doctor says, we need to come clean about this diabetes thing. And of course, that just got buried by Eli Lilly. You got the words exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's move on to you're contacted. You need to subpoena in order to get these Zyprexa papers. So that is where your client, Bill Bigsley, comes in. Was he already your client, or did you seek him out for this specific purpose? How did that work?
Yeah, it's Bill Bigley.
Mhm.
So yeah, you can't just subpoena someone. You've got to have a case and a legitimate reason to subpoena someone. And I didn't have anyone. And in Alaska, the psychiatric imprisonment cases, they call it involuntary commitment. But really, when you think about it, it's psychiatric imprisonment. And forced freeing cases are secret. I mean, the statute says, at least for the psychiatric imprisonment, that the hearing shall be open or closed as the respondent, that's the person who they're trying to lock up and drug, may elect. But they never told them about, their right to have it open to the public. So they're all extremely secret. And so I had to find someone, and I had told Eagle, well, I'm going to Hawaii for vacation. This was, right at the end of November. He said, oh, these cases are going to settle, and you have to do it before then, and I'll lose access, so you have to do it before then. And so anyway, I actually went to the Alaska Psychiatric Institute, API, and I had flyers saying, if you want, you want me to represent you in a forced drugging, and I'd hand them out to, family members coming in and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the hospital was upset and they banned me, and I said, you can't ban me. And so that was, and the assistant attorney general said I was violating, professional ethics, basically, and you're not supposed to solicit clients as a private attorney. People that, like ambulance chasing. But for a public interest law firm, such as PsychRights, the law project for psychiatric rights, actually you're allowed to go out and see clients to further your mission, to represent someone to further your mission. So there was all that. And anyway, in any event, so actually there was someone with the Disability Law Center who would visit, would go in periodically, and she identified Bill Bigley. And so then I went in to meet him, and that's how I got him. I mean, so I'll just say a little bit about that. One of the things that happened there was I asked Bill to sign a release, an authorization for release of information. And they said he couldn't sign it because he had a guardian, and only the guardian could sign it. And so I didn't have proof at that time that he had been drugged with Zyprexa. And that ended up causing me a lot of trouble, months later. And I was pretty sure he had, because it was just used so much there. And I asked him, but he had other things on his mind. And so I wasn't absolutely sure.
Yeah. So you sort of took him on in sort of blind hope, assuming that he had been given Zyprexa. And then how much longer was it till you were able to confirm that?
Well, so even if he hadn't been given it, he was certainly subject to, possibly being given it in the future. So even if he hadn't been given it at that time, it could have. Well, so I was in Brooklyn in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, basically January 16th and 17th of 2007. And I couldn't testify at that time that it was, but within a couple weeks of that, I got access to his records, and it turns out he had been drugged against his will with Zyprexa just a few days before I, started representing him, before I met him, and in early January of 2008, in other words, just a few weeks after, well, a month later, he was drugged against his will with Zyprexa. So he had been drugged against his will with Zyprexa.
Yeah. So then you get the Zyprexa papers because you're able to subpoena the expert because you have this client now that was drugged with Zyprexa. But there was controversy around this, and essentially you were accused of conspiring to steal the documents, right? Eli Lilly threatened you with criminal contempt charges.
Right, and to have me disbarred, to take my law license away. And actually the judge found that I had conspired to steal the document. So that, that was pretty scary. But they assumed that they said, well, Bill hadn't even been drugged with Zyprexa. So and that wasn't true. So yeah, I mean, I thought Dr. Eagleman thought that Eli Lilly wouldn't act in time. And one of the things we found out later was when they negotiated the secrecy agreement, that originally it said that the expert couldn't respond to the subpoena in less than 10, until 10 days after notice. And then they changed that to make it a reasonable opportunity to object, which is, what does that mean? How many days is that? And so there's no doubt in my mind that the reason Eli Lilly did that was so that they could argue no matter how long it was, they could say they hadn't had a reasonable opportunity to object. And it turns out that we found this out later too, that something similar had happened a couple years before, and the lawyers were too timid to say, "Oh, you blew the deadlines," and they were just locked in litigation over whether it's lost its confidentiality for years. And so I wasn't so timid, and Eagleman decided that Lilly had been given a reasonable opportunity to object. This was after I had gotten this call from Alaska lawyer saying he was representing Lilly. I got this voicemail. It was Hanukkah. It was late in the afternoon, and I didn't. Anyway, so I didn't really want to talk to him, but I didn't want him to think I was avoiding him. So the first thing I did is I called Eagleman, and I said, they're on to us. And I knew that even though they'd been a little bit slow, they'd be big and fast once they got going. And so Eagleman started sending them to me. And what I did was I thought, well, I'll call this lawyer back at 8 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, figuring that he very well might not be in yet. And leave a message for him, and then he can't say that I was avoiding him. And that's what I did. And I don't know that Eli Lilly ever knew that, because they finally that was a Wednesday, I think. They sent me a letter on Friday. I had already received the documents from Eagleman and then gotten them out. And so then I got this phone call from the special discovery master in the Zyprexa, litigation in Brooklyn, so, ordering me not to disseminate them and to return them, and that, I guess basically telling me that he needed to talk to me about it, and he would, gave me his number, and he would be available all weekend. And then a couple hours later, I got an actual written order from him, ordering me to return them and not, to disseminate them. And I go, well, how does he get to order me about? And it turns out really he didn't have authority to. But anyway, that was a Friday, and I wrote him an email, I think on Sunday. But by that time, the first of the front page stories on the New York Times had already been published.
Yeah. So you get them and they're for the purposes of your case, but then you're able to give them to other people to make them public. How does that work?
So that's one of the things I researched before I did it, was if I have a legitimate reason to subpoena something, can I, also have another reason? And the answer to that is yes. So what was the question again?
Just if you subpoenaed them for the purposes of the Bill Bigsley case, how is it legal that you're able to give it to the newspaper or to, somebody else
Right.
to spread it to the public, essentially?
So there's one, the issue of the dual purpose of the subpoena. The other is the principle that something is confidential only as long as it in fact remains confidential. And these documents, and well, in my view, but lost their confidentiality once I got them. I mean, they were, under the secrecy order. If I subpoenaed them and Lily was given a reasonable opportunity to object and I got them, they were no longer subject to that secrecy order. So that's how that.
So how long did it end up being the reasonable opportunity? How long did you guys wind up giving them?
About a week.
Oh, okay. Seems reasonable to me, right? Yeah.
Well, in the secrecy order, there was a place where only 3 days notice. It was for something else. I forget what it is, but where 3 days notice was what was required. So, yeah, maybe it was 6 days. And yeah, so, but that was Eagleman's call. I thought that Lily would, object immediately, and then I would be in court in Alaska saying this, this is why my client is entitled to him. They're trying to drug him against their will. The Myers case had just come out about 6 months before, and they, I have a right to show that it's not in his best interest, and that's what these documents show. And I'm entitled to them. I expected that to happen. And then, but then I got them, and then it's like I said, I knew they'd be big and fast, so I immediately got them to the New York Times. Although actually, Eagleman had already been sharing them with Alex Berenson, and I got them out to other people too, because I thought that was important, including getting them out on the internet in a way that couldn't be traced or taken back.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you were kind of scared when the judge did decide that you'd conspired to steal them. I mean, what were you feeling this whole time? Were you frightened? I mean, every time I think of a big, rich drug company, which has all the power in the world, it just makes me shudder to think if one was sort of after me or whatever. So how are you feeling? And then how did it result with when you said the judge did side against you? How did that come out in the wash in the end?
Well, so yeah, it was, I was frightened, anxious, maybe probably anxious, might be the biggest word, quite anxious about it, because I was, facing financial ruin, which I kind of thought was a possibility from the beginning. But, I knew there were thousands of people that were being killed by this drug. So in comparison, it seemed like a reasonable thing. But then what happened is, by the time we got after the judge decided that, which was about a month later. So the New York Times was the middle of December. The trial in Brooklyn was the middle of January, and the decision came out in the middle of February of 2003. And by that time, we knew that Bill had been drugged against his will with Zyprexa. So, and of course, we told Lily that, and it looked a lot different. And so we entered into these protracted settlement negotiations, and in the end, Lilly reneged. I mean, we had a deal, and they said, "Oh, we can't actually write it up because there was this case where the state of Alaska had sued Lilly for the costs of treating these diabetes and other metabolic problems caused by Zyprexa, and they I was going to take that opportunity, and Alex Berenson was coming to cover the trial, and so I was going to take that opportunity to get some coverage of our issue in forced drugging and stuff. And so they said, well, if you talk to Berenson, or if you talk to any other media person, we're not going to settle. And to my shame, it's like, well, if I can get out from under this, I'll do it. And so I didn't really like it, and so I agreed to that. And then then I didn't do that after trial, and they reneged.
Yeah.
And
I don't think there's any shame in that, though, Jim. I think you had done so much already, taking such a huge risk to expose this. So I don't know. I think most people probably would have at that point done the same thing.
Well, I mean, it's like, okay, I did, got the papers and released them out and then so after that, I mean, my biggest focus was trying to minimize the adverse consequences to me on that. And so and it seemed like there, anyway, I did agree to it. I should never have trusted Lilly. I mean, because it's just not honest.
Yeah. But you said something just a minute ago that the state of Alaska was suing Lilly for the cost of having to treat all of these patients with metabolic disorders now. But then weren't they at the same time still forced drugging people with Zyprexa simultaneously or other medications?
Yeah, and I'd actually told Lilly that, and they used it in the trial. So yeah, and they're doing it to this day. The interesting thing, I mean, and the Alaska trial was the first one, but I think 33 states sued Lilly over it, and Alaska was the first one to come to trial. And the state's computer system was so screwed up they couldn't even come up with a number for how much it cost them. And so I forget exactly what the settlement amount was, but it was really low because of that. And then that meant, and so all the other states followed suit. And so Lilly really got off cheap on these lawsuits because of the state of Alaska not being able to prove how much it cost them.
Oh, I see. So one thing that I found in reading about this, that was, I mean, we see it all the time, this statement. I mean, I'm not surprised that Lilly said it, but doctors seem to say it a lot too, that the documents or the information shouldn't be available to the public because you might scare people who really need this medication, and maybe then they'll stop taking it. What do you think about that?
Well, it's circular for one thing, and it assumes something that's not true. I mean, people in the public mental health system diagnosed with serious mental illness now have a 20 to 25 years shorter lifespan, and that's virtually all attributable to the drugs, and especially that now people are giving multiple drugs at the same time. And it's no question that it's very harmful and kills a lot of people. And so to say that they need them, and then the other part of it is, I mean, places, the Soteria study in the 70s and the open dialogue approach in Finland have shown that you can get an 80% recovery rate if you help people without immediate resort to these neuroleptics. And in our system, giving the drugs to everybody is the recovery rate is 5 or 6%. So to say that people need these drugs is just wrong. And I mean, I know people who find the drugs helpful, and I think they should have access to them. I think they should be told the truth about them. But even if they want them, if they find them helpful, that's fine for adults, not children. But it's just basically part of the fraudulent nature of psychiatry as it's practiced today in the main.
Yeah. But from a legal perspective or, constitutionally, that kind of thing, people are legally entitled to informed consent and the truth about something, or no?
Yes, they are. And in fact, I mean, depends state by state, but if you don't get give informed consent and they give you a drug, that's technically a battery, like an assault and battery, because and so yeah, people are absolutely entitled to informed consent. And of course, this forced drugging regime, as they say, oh, this person is not competent to make that decision, and then so we have to make that before them. But that decision maker is supposed to have all the information too.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that maybe isn't directly responding to your question, but a lot of psychiatric patients are much more knowledgeable about the adverse effects of these drugs than the doctors, or at least that the doctors will admit to. And so they know that they're very harmful. And one, if they say that, then that's put down as proof that they're mentally ill. That's a symptom. They delusionally think that they're harmful. But then also think about it, is they're being forced to take this drug that they know hurts, is harmful to them. And that's just a terrible thing. And it's, I mean, I think of that, the system as violence perpetrated against, their, supposed patients. If it's not voluntary, it's not treatment.
Yeah. I laugh at the part where you say they're, the patients knowing that a medication is harmful, which you could easily just research, right? And see that there are harms and risks. I mean, it comes in the pamphlet with the drug, but that makes you delusional. And then you and Bill had something in common where you were both told you were delusional because you thought you went to Harvard Law School, which you did. And Bill, they said, when he said he was in the New York Times, they said that was a delusion, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the public defender said, oh, he actually was. And the doctor said, oh, yeah. But he may have actually won that case, actually.
Wow.
The public defender. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you get the papers. What was inside of them? I mean, what were the internal emails and marketing materials and memorandums? Like what was Lily's big scheme? What were they doing?
So I actually had very little time to look at them, because I knew Lily, like I said, Lily was going to be big and fast. And so when I first got them, I looked at some of them, but basically, I mean, I was making DVDs on 3 computers, and I had my rock music going, and addressing envelopes and stuff like that. So, and then shortly after that, within a couple of days, I was ordered to, return them and not disseminate them. Mm-hmm. So I actually don't know. I haven't read all of them. So what I know is basically from the newspaper accounts, mostly from the New York Times, but also Evelyn Pringle's great reporting on it. So, but I do know, like they had, the information about diabetes, and to me it was like, well, I already knew that because Dr. Jackson had, in her report and 3 years before, had said it caused diabetes, and so, but I knew that having the New York Times say that, would be a big deal. So the diabetes and metabolic problems, which they hid and lied about. And then there was a lot of material about how to get doctors to prescribe it off label, which is illegal.
Mhm.
And the prescribing off label is not illegal, but Eli Lilly promoting its off label use was illegal. And so, they had examples of PowerPoints that the sales reps should put on. And I think one of the programs was called Donna or something like that. And then for the elderly, and I think stuff about how much money they expected to make, or hope to make from Zyprexa.
Mhm.
Um,
So do
but
you think, based on that, do you think the drug reps who are being taught this kind of thing know that they're being taught to deceive, or it's the knowledge of deception is at the level of the person teaching, and then the drug rep just believes they've been given accurate information?
I don't really know the answer to that. I think it's a mixture,
Yeah.
and I think that, well, first off, I for a long time I thought that people that were doing this had good intentions.
Mhm.
They just didn't know. But there's so much information out about it now that I think that's pretty hard to maintain. So
Yeah.
at the time, I think maybe they didn't know. I think some had, came to know, and some former reps, I think Gwen Olson is one, you know, came to know, and then she's been outspoken against it. And then there's this guy, I forget his name, in Europe who, has been on a mea culpa, I'm to blame tour in Europe because he basically bribed some European regulators to get Zyprexa approved.
Yeah, I gotcha. So, in the book, it said to a small group of psychiatric survivors spread the Zyprexa papers on the internet untraceably. So what did you do when you got them? You just slipped them to people that you knew would be able to disseminate them other than the New York Times, or?
Well, I mailed copies to a bunch of people, not that many. I
Mhm.
think maybe less than a dozen. And then Vera Sharav, who, had this, she was just fabulous in a trial. She had heard about it and called and asked me to send her 2 copies.
Mhm.
But for this, um, uh, so, and Will has, I mean, I talked to him before the book, and he was willing for me to say who he is.
Mhm.
Um, uh, there's this internet protocol called FTP file transfer protocol that's designed to transfer a lot of files and large files. And so he got those, and then he sent them to Jonah Bosowicz, who's also a psychiatric survivor, and he got them out on I think it's called Tor. Anyway, it was kind of a precursor to WikiLeaks, and so they
Mhm.
couldn't be gotten out. And one of the things, so one of the most dramatic, Will really didn't want to be identified, and I told him, well, if the right question is asked, I'm going to have to tell him.
Mhm.
And I think the most dramatic, maybe the second most dramatic point in the trial was when Eli Lilly was rooting around about that, and they didn't ask the right question, and the judge finally said to move on. And so, but one of the things that I try and do in the book is, people believe that someone who's diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or serious mental illness, that it's a permanent thing, it's a brain defect. They're not going to recover. And so there were a number of psychiatric survivors that were involved. Will Hall was one, David Oakes, Judy Chamberlain. Well, Judy Chamberlain wasn't involved that much, although I sent her the papers. Ted Chabazinski. Oh, I'm forgetting. Laura Ziegler. And so one of the things I do in the book is try and subtly bust that myth. I write at least a paragraph about each of them, about how they've been diagnosed with serious mental illness and gotten through it, and on to live really superlative lives, very productive. And
Yeah. And you too, having had this psychosis that, doesn't affect you anymore, other than, in that one instance that you recovered from just being sleep deprived. So, I want to know what the outcome of Mr. Bigley's hearing was then, because you accepted him so that you could subpoena all of this, but then I assume you had to see his trial through to the end. So they were trying to continue force drugging him, but you argued that it wasn't in his best interest. And so whatever happened to him?
So there were basically a series of cases. I mean, there's a guardianship case that went, continued along. And so when I first met him, he'd been hospitalized about 70 times, and in the end it was 100 times. But in the last case that I really represented him, and the reason I quit representing him is that his guardian didn't want me to represent him. And I mean, we're kind of running out of time, but basically the Alaska Supreme Court said if he wasn't competent to choose me, he couldn't choose me, and the judge said he wasn't competent to choose me, and so and I was prohibited to contact him, and which made me feel bad because I felt like he felt I had abandoned him, but he would still contact me. But the last case I did represent him, I had proved that these drugs would shorten his life, cause him brain damage, and shorten his life. And Dr. Grace Jackson had testified in an earlier case that if he was continued to be drugged, he would be dead within 5 years. And his guardian testified that well, the quality of his life is more important than the quantity of his life. Bill's, what Bill felt about his quality of life, how, what he thought was better, was totally irrelevant. And the judge ordered him to be drugged, saying, well, even if it does shorten his life, Bill is not well now and he's getting worse. And he basically died just a few months after that, 5 years.
Wow, that's yeah, and no consideration probably for that. Maybe all the drugs he was on was contributing to why he was in such a bad way to begin with, right?
Well, but I presented a massive amount of evidence that it was. And but when the reality is that the legal system, with the participation of psychiatry, is really designed to get troublesome people out of the way. So it's not really about helping people. It's really about getting them out of the way.
Yeah, and you've
so
said
so that they're not disturbing people.
Yeah, you've said in some of your interviews too that even the lawyers representing them don't really do that much to fight for them, or the way the system is set up, they only get a small period of time, and then it's just, they don't have somebody really fighting for them.
Both of those things are true. I mean, a lot of the public defenders or appointed lawyers basically have the attitude, if my client wasn't crazy, they'd know this was good for them. And they don't present any of the evidence. And one of the things I try and do is I have all this stuff on the internet, and so all this information is, excuse me, available. And in fact, that we've on the PsychRights.org website, we have this forced drugging defense package, which is a set of pleadings, legal papers to challenge forced drugging with affidavits in support of them. And so there's that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, about the amount of time. So in Alaska, typically the petition to psychiatrically imprison someone and drug them might include a forced drugging petition at the same time is filed in the morning, and they want to have the trial that afternoon. And and there may be 4 or 5 of them in that single day, and all of those people are represented by one public defender. And so the legal system is a sham.
Yeah. So the take home really is hopefully stay out of that system as much as possible if you can, because you can be trapped in there and then not have much help or good representation to get out. That's frightening to think about.
What is it? The Hotel California, you can check in, but
check
you
in
can't
but never
check.
leave. Oh my
You can't
God.
check out. I mean, that's basically true with the psych hospital. I advise people to never voluntarily check into a psych hospital. And my big focus, I'm not really doing litigation now, but my big focus right now is to try and get, these programs that work made more widely available, such as soteria houses and peer respites. There was this international peer respite soteria summit and last year, and we're following up on that and really trying to create resources for people to do that. And there's a lot going on that, and other approaches such as open dialogue and healing homes and the Hearing Voices Network. These are all very effective programs that don't cause harm.
So just quickly, and then I think we have one question from the audience. Do you know what the direct impact of exposing the papers was? Did the sales plummet? And did Lilly ever come forward and admit to what they did? Or did they just say, the standard legal, we don't believe there's evidence of harm type of response?
Right. The settlements all said we don't agree that the plaintiffs are right, but just to get them out of the way, we're going to settle. Mm-hmm. I think for a short period of time, the plaintiff's lawyer were less likely to agree to keep the document, similar documents secret. But I think that's gone back to normal. I do think getting the Zyprexa papers out saved many lives. Maybe tens of thousands. Yeah. Well worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Audience member wants to know, taking into account the very long history of this and the documented evidence of human rights violations of psychiatric patients, why do you think it's not covered by Amnesty International?
That's a good question, because they've been approached many times, as has the, American Civil Liberties Union, and they refuse to touch it. And I don't really know why. I mean, I think, the fact that our people are dying 20, 25 years earlier than average, and that there's not an uproar over this just shows that society doesn't really care about these people, and that's an acceptable outcome. Yeah. So I think it's that basically they think that people diagnosed with serious mental illness are really defective, and really are not worth the effort.
Yeah. Okay, this person says Purdue were bankrupted as a result of the opioid crisis being taken to state attorney generals. How is this transferable to psychiatric meds, forced drugging, human rights abuses under psychiatry?
So there have been a lot of similar cases. I mean, Lilly paid about $1.5 billion to the plaintiffs. They paid $1.4 billion to the federal government for the illegal marketing. and that's just the cost of doing business. And in that year, I think 2005, they made $5 billion on Zyprexa. So that wasn't even 1 year's profit from Zyprexa. So it's just a cost of doing business. And yeah, I think, I mean, another question is, why haven't anybody been brought up on murder charges?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this next person and the last question is taking into account that all this information is so widely known, so easily accessible. Why is ignorance an acceptable defense, whether it be for mental health professionals, lawyers, anyone? How can we make accountability and responsibility a reality?
Well, we just somehow have to break through and get the general public to understand what's going on. And that was a big reason why I wrote the Zyprexa papers, because I felt and feel if it could get some, widespread acceptance, readership in the general public, that it could have a pretty significant impact. But, the pharmaceutical industry pays a huge amount in advertising. It's, direct to consumer advertising in the US. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's compromised the news reporting on this. And so that's one of the really bad effects of the direct to consumer advertising that happens in the US.
Yeah. I mean, I've always thought, like, if people knew all of the corruption and the lies and the harm, all the power lies with the people, right? If you don't go to the pharmacy and fill the prescription and take the drugs and you're using alternatives, well, then they kind of go out of business. But we're the consumer. So I feel like you have to get to the people who are being marketed to. And so hopefully more people will see this interview and they'll get your book and realize just how, corrupt it is out there and how cautious they need to be about being their own best health advocate, essentially. So on that note, since we've made it here an hour, do you have any last closing thoughts for people, or a place you want to direct anybody to before we go?
Well, there's psychrights.org. And then really my big focus right now is the International Peer Respite Soteria Summit, which you can Google. It's, I think, peerrespite-soteria.org, but I'd have to,
we'll find it. We'll find it and put it in the comments.
Okay,
and definitely in the video description for people watching later on YouTube. Yeah. Right.
So yeah, the big thing is to really try and educate the public about this and try and get these alternatives going. Yeah. I think that's and there's a lot happening on that right now. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for all of your work in trying to get this information out to people, and also just for being a whistleblower. I mean, I didn't realize, I don't think, until I learned about the Zyprexa papers and talking to you, like how much you put on the line to put yourself out there and expose this information. And that's really huge. I mean, it's a public health service that you did, risking your own self. And I don't think it gets any more brave than that. So thank you so much. Thank you. It's my pleasure. You're very kind. Yeah. All right. So thanks everybody for joining us for this live discussion. If you've yet to see Medicating Normal, you can go to our website at medicatingnormal.com/watch for the many ways you can rent and buy it. Check out the events tab on our Facebook page for more interviews like this one. And lastly, if you'd like to support the outreach efforts to bring Medicating Normal to communities worldwide, you can make a donation at medicatingnormal.com/donate. Thanks again, Jim, for being here, and everybody else for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.